Great, thanks, Marisa. All right, just a couple of reminders before we get started. So as Marisa said, make sure that the name that appears with your picture is your first and last name, just like you were making out a name tag. If you need any tech help throughout the presentation, you can chat to Andrea Eckelberger, including if you need help changing that name. We are recording today. And then we encourage you to go ahead and open the chat now. We'll be using the chat throughout the workshop today. But otherwise, you can keep your mic and your camera off unless we ask you to turn them on and chime in. We'll be doing small groups later today, and then of course you'll need to turn those back on. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So you are here at Talk Amongst Yourselves. We're going to talk today about how to get your students talking in small groups in online learning. And my name is Jessica Jones, and I am a teacher at Literacy Minnesota. I have been teaching in ABE or coordinating volunteers for about 18 years. And my co-host.
Hello, everybody. I'm Liddy Rich. I teach ESL also. I work in North St. Paul at Harmony Learning Center, and I've been teaching adults for about 12 years, but before that I taught kids in Minneapolis for about 12 years or so, but currently teaching online intermediate students.
Great. And now we'd like to learn a little bit about you. So you should have a poll showing up in just a minute that you can tell us a little bit about what your teaching situation is. There's 2 questions there, and you can check as many of those options as apply to you. So very quickly, take a minute and tell us a little bit about what teaching looks like for you right now. Great. Let's see. Give you about 30 seconds more to register your situation with us. See, some people are still hopping in. All right, that's probably enough to get us started. So Marisa, if you want to go ahead and show the results of that poll to everybody. All right, so it looks like we do have a large number of people teaching online synchronously, which is great. This is going to be really well suited to you. And if you're not teaching online and you're teaching in some other format, you might think about how you could use the skills we're going to talk about today in an asynchronous format where students might be trading recordings back and forth. And it looks like we also have a lot of ESL teachers, but what we're going to talk about today really could apply to both ESL learners and native speakers. All right, thanks, Marisa. I think that's good. All right, so our agenda today, we're going to talk about what it takes to create a supportive learning environment for conversation, meaningful conversation to take place. And then we're going to focus on really 3 skills that you can teach explicitly to students to help them have better conversations, more engaging, more long-lasting conversations. And we're going to look at one activity that you can use to kind of bring all those conversation skills together in small group practice. As we go here, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll leave time at the end for people who want to ask their questions out loud. But for now, if you have questions as we go, put them in the chat and Liddy will be watching that and she'll shout out if we've got a question that needs to be answered right away. So first of all, I want you to think a little bit about what do students need foremost to engage in meaningful conversation. And I would say that the very first thing they need is to feel safe and valued and connected. And there's actually a fair amount of research to back this up. I'm reading this book right now. Many of you have maybe heard of it or read it. The Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. And she says that we are really wired to look for socially safe situations, and we want to connect with each other, but we also want to minimize social risk. And so if you're putting students into a situation that feels socially and emotionally unsafe, they're unlikely to be able to have a very good conversation with each other. So then our challenge as teachers is, how do we create that environment? How do we help students find safety and connection, especially at a time when, the technology feels sometimes like a barrier to being really connected with other people? And then how do we help them relax and let go of stress so that they can focus on learning? There's a lot of stress in everyone's life right now, and that's not an easy thing to do. So I think one of my students gave me one of the nicest compliments the other day. She said that when she comes to class, she just feels like everything else in her life goes away for an hour. So for an hour, she feels like she gets to just kind of let go of those other things. And I thought, oh, that's a sign that I'm doing something right, that she feels that safety and relaxation when she's in class. So that is not exactly the focus of today's workshop. We're going to be talking about kind of the nitty-gritty of the skill building around conversations. But I just wanted to say that I think, I couldn't get into talking about skill building without talking about creating that sense of safety for students. Again, this is the title of the book I'm reading. And if you have other things that you're reading as part of your work on creating culturally relevant classrooms, or things about classroom culture, I'd love to have you put those in the chat for everybody, things that you think contribute to students' sense of safety and connectedness and relationship building. All right, so we're going to get right into those 3 skills that I told you about, the 3 things that I think help anyone have a more engaging conversation and a conversation that really moves forward. And so the first one is being able to restate or summarize what someone said. And this gets to the crux of good conversation, which is listening, right? So if we're really listening, then we're able to restate what other people say. And if we're not able to restate what other people say, it might be a sign that we haven't really truly been listening to what others are saying. And then the second one is asking follow-up questions, so that we're being curious about each other and each other's experiences and each other's thoughts and ideas. And then finally, it's adding on to an idea that someone else has said. So not just you're going to tell your opinion and I'm going to give my opinion, but I'm going to show that I've been listening by connecting my comment to your comment. All right, so we're going to kind of work backwards today, and we're going to start with this culminating activity, this thing that is going to be our goal for the day, that students are able to do this at some point. And then later we're going to go back and kind of break down how you get to that point. Okay, so Liddy is going to talk a little bit about how implementing this routine affected teaching and learning in her classroom.
So this is a routine that I used quite a bit in person. In my class, we called it conversation circles. And I want to totally reiterate what Jessica said earlier about creating community, because having this time where students are sitting in a table sitting around a table and talking to each other and really listening and asking each other questions has been a really powerful way of having students connect to each other. It was highly engaging in person, and when we shifted online back in March, I have figured out ways of implementing the big picture of these conversation circles and also a lot of the individual components. So I always tell students that when we're doing these conversations, one of the goals is to get to know each other and to be known by each other. And so that setting up the expectation that they're there to really talk and really listen and really share has been really helpful. The thing that I've noticed as we've done this online is that I've added new routines, of course, and one of the routines that we have is when we start a class, I give them a question, everybody asks a question, and the more we do the conversation circles, the more I have students that are saying, wait, I have a follow-up question. Can I ask some questions? Do we have time for questions? And so that's been really heartening and also great evidence that that the moves are becoming more intrinsic to them.
All right, awesome. So, like I said, we're gonna throw you into the digital version of this activity. So this activity started, both Liddy and I have used this in our classroom as an analog activity where this piece of paper sat in the middle of the table and then was rotated to show that people have different jobs at different points in the conversation. So I was surprised actually at how easily this translated when we moved online. So what this looks like now in my classroom is that one participant starts by choosing a question from a list of questions that I give the students, and then they answer that question. And then another student is going to summarize what they just heard from that student. Now, in a small group, a lot of times students will just volunteer. They'll say, okay, I'll summarize what he said. But in a larger group, often the teacher has to call on someone and say, okay, can you summarize what they just said? And then after that, the remaining students are going to ask follow-up questions. So we usually ask 2 or 3 follow-up questions per speaker. And then we just keep going, but we now start with a new speaker. So now someone else becomes speaker number 1, and someone else is going to choose role 2, and someone else is going to choose role 3. Or in a large group, the teacher is going to call on people to do each of those roles. So today I'm going to ask you to try the same thing because I want you to experience this activity firsthand. And then, like I said, we're going to go back and break it down and talk about how you can create this with your learners and get them ready to do this kind of self-facilitated group work. Okay, so once again, remember these roles because these are going to be important. One person is going to choose a question from the list and answer it. One person's going to summarize what that person just said. And then 1 or 2 people are going to ask follow-up questions of the original speaker. And then once you've gone through these roles, then someone else can start again as role number 1. So here are your 2 questions for today. Who was your favorite person when you were a young child and why? And where did you live when you were a young child? Describe that place. So at the moment, Andrea is putting those into the chat. So you can either use the chat to reference those when you get into your small groups, or you might take a minute to jot these down. Or as my students often do, you just grab your phone and take a little screenshot so that you have them for later. Okay, so everyone is going to need these 2 questions in order to do our activity. And I see that someone asked, are these prepared questions? So yep, we'll talk a little bit more about questions later, but you definitely need a prepared list of questions going into this activity. All right. I think we're ready. We're going to put you in your small groups. You'll have 5 minutes in your group. So dive in, and as you're working, the goal is to pay attention to your own thinking. What skills are you having to use in order to complete this activity? And how do you feel about it as you're doing it? All right, here we go.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. You all spent 5 minutes in a breakout room. We had a couple questions for you. Who was your favorite person when you were a young child? Where did you live? I lost it right there. It just moved on me. So we want to take a few minutes to do some reflecting. We've got some questions here for you, and I'll read them out in just a moment. But I want to invite anybody who would like to turn off their camera and speak to, don't just jump in and do that. We've got a really large room. If you put your name in the chat and say, I want to say something, we'll call on a couple of people, and then we'll ask the rest of you to put your ideas into the chat. So as you think about your experience in the breakout room, thinking how was that for you? Was it easy? What was easy? What was challenging about it? How did it feel? Think about the different roles that you were asked to take, as the person asking, as the person answering, as the person summarizing, as the people asking follow-up questions. How did the assigned roles affect how you interacted with each other? Which of those skills did you notice yourself using? Or what other skills? What skills did you notice yourself using? And finally, how does this inform how you would do this with your students? So would love to hear some people talking out. If you can put your name in the chat. We'll call on some people, or we'll read through some of the ideas here. It looks like Marilyn. Marilyn, why don't you start? Turn your camera on and tell us what you think.
The summarizing part was not natural because we don't do that usually. And so that was difficult. And in our group, everyone was so ready to ask those follow-up questions because that's what we do.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. That's great. Allison, I see you've got some.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say really quickly that I hope my my breakout roommates weren't offended, because I immediately I didn't want to lose the time we had. And so I just jumped in and said, okay, who wants to start? And we did it. We had a really great, everyone participated, everybody shared their thoughts very easily. It was such a great, simple, but big bang for the buck activity. I really, really like it. I want to use it. And I guess my takeaway is that I would want to designate someone, the initiator, who's going to start this, and that role may also change or may stay the same for the activity. Thanks very much.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for sharing.
Good. And just a reminder, we've got lots of people who still have their video on. If you can help us conserve bandwidth by turning your video on unless you're asked to speak. And so you should see an icon that says stop video, and you can click on that. You'll then have, if you have a red line through your video camera icon, that means your camera's off.
Any other thoughts? How does this inform how you would do this with your students? I've seen some people talking about wanting more assigned roles, making sure that there's somebody that will initiate. Yep, absolutely. There's lots in the chat. Let me see if I can, I'm not sure I can quite summarize everything. Somebody commented that we are not as shy as our students might be. Well, I'll add that later.
Looks like Jamie has something to say.
Great.
Jamie, do you want to go ahead and turn on your mic?
Is video okay too, or just mic?
Sure, that's good.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie. Yeah, so how this would inform how I would do this, I think I would want to give them some scaffolding of how to form a question. I do teach college readiness, so my students are higher level, and some of them are actually native English speakers from other countries. I tend to let them carry the conversation. So this is just a good reminder for me that I need to scaffold it down to everyone. I want to use the word down, but yeah, so I would probably model some questioning strategies beforehand and kind of model it as a whole class before I did this, but this was great. I'm definitely going to use this, so thank you.
Great.
Excellent, thank you. All right. All right, thanks everybody for your reflections, and I think we're ready to go on to the next part.
Great. And Andrea, it looks like we may still have someone in the waiting room. At least that's what's appearing on my screen. Okay, good. Yeah, so let's talk about questions. And I know some people ask, like, where do you get your list of questions? So during the next breakout room, when I have a couple minutes, I will pull up a favorite website link and put that in the chat, because I do have one that I really like as at least a starting place to think about my questions. So all in all, this is about as low prep as an activity can be. But the one really important part of prep is the questions. So a few really well-crafted questions can actually spur a fairly long conversation, but they need to be really thoughtful. So my guidelines for questions for you are make your questions as concise as possible. That will depend a lot on the level of the learners that you're working with. So obviously more advanced learners with higher reading levels can take more complex questions. So write your questions to fit the level of your student, obviously. And then with that is to keep in mind that the questions should be ones that you think your learners will understand without much teaching. This isn't a vocabulary lesson. It isn't a reading lesson. You want the focus to be on the conversation. And so you want to choose questions that you think they will be able to understand or help each other understand without much pre-teaching. You certainly can use it to review things like new vocabulary if you feel like the vocabulary is very secure by the time you're going into this activity. Your questions should be open-ended, so they should encourage a lot of, they should encourage original answers from different students and things that you think people have something to say about. So that's part of why I chose childhood. Most people are happy to talk about their childhood or at least have something that they're willing to share about their childhood. And so I think this to me is also part of the safety aspect of creating these conversation groups, is that I stop and think really carefully about each question. Is it a question that is going to put someone on the spot to divulge something about their life that they don't want to? And a good question in my mind gives them so many different avenues to answer that they can easily avoid talking about things that they're not comfortable talking about, and focus on something else. So, and then I think also that we're avoiding questions that make assumptions about people, right? So we're avoiding a question that would assume that people were raised in a two-parent household or raised by their biological parents. We're avoiding questions that assume that someone went to grade school when they might not have. So that's where the culturally relevant piece really comes into play. All right, so with those guidelines in mind, I want you to look at these 3 questions from a unit about health and think about which of these questions do you think best fits the criteria we just talked about and why. So we're going to do this part in the chat. So go ahead, look through those, and then in the chat, tell me, what do you think? Which of these questions would you most likely put before your students? You can just put the number of the question. And then why do you think that is the best question of the three? Or if you don't like any of them, you can go ahead and say that you won't. I'm tough, I can take it.
We're seeing a lot of number 3s popping up with some ideas of some whys, some 2s and 3s. Somebody made a great comment. As the parent of an adopted child, I would toss out number 1. Some ideas about number 3, it seems most neutral and open. It's less personal, but everyone can still answer it. It's relatable to all. It allows for deeper thinking. 2 seems like it's fill in the blank and not so personal.
Great. Yeah, so I think what you're picking up on is excellent, is part of how I often craft questions. So a lot of times questions that I find are really good, but they all focus on the speaker. So they'll say, have you ever had this experience? Or do you have this problem? Or I'm trying to think of some other examples, but they're very focused on the speaker. And a lot of times what I do is I'll take the same idea and I'll refocus it in general. So why do you think some people think blah, blah, blah? Or why do you think some people have problems with blah, blah, blah? And that gives students a lot more freedom to sort of expound on an idea without having to divulge things that are personal to them. All right, great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the scaffolding for this. Because not every class is ready to just jump into this activity. Some are, and I know some teachers who've walked out of this workshop in the past and gone right into their classroom and used the activity the next day, and it's gone brilliantly. But if you don't feel like that's your class right now, that is okay, because these skills do take practice. And so let's talk a little bit about how we can get that practice started. So that first skill of restating or summarizing. So a number of people said, like, it didn't really feel natural to restate and summarize in my discussion. And it's true that unless you're in a sort of counseling situation, it's unusual to say, like, I hear you saying blah, 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 right? But it does show active listening. And I would say that it's probably the most accessible skill to start working on. So if you work with beginning level students, this is a really good place to start. For one thing, when students are forced to summarize, they immediately all tune in, especially if they don't know who's going to be called on to summarize. And then it also naturally reinforces the need for clarification strategies and phrases. So when I first started doing this with students, I would do it in whole class discussions. And I would start by calling on one student to answer a question. And I would remind everybody, listen carefully. And then I would call on another student. I would say, could you summarize what that person just said? And if they couldn't, then I would encourage them. I would say, okay, can you ask them to repeat what they just said? And I would, rather than me turning and asking for the repetition, I would ask that student to ask a clarification question or ask for repetition from the other student. If they said, oh, I didn't understand them, they were speaking too fast, I said, okay, can you ask them to repeat their answer more slowly? And so it helps both parties in that conversation. The first person gets some feedback on how well they're being understood by their peers. And then the other person gets practice with clarification strategies. And when they know they're going to be asked to summarize, this starts to happen really naturally. And I think it just adds so much richness to the class conversation, even though it's not necessarily a natural thing to do in conversation. And then the last thing, and this is the challenge for teachers, is you have to get out of the way. So when I first started doing this, I was floored to realize how much I was paraphrasing for the students. So I realized that my knee-jerk reaction whenever a student gave an answer was to turn back to the rest of the class and summarize what that student just said. Well, I've just basically taken away their voice, right? And I've sort of made the statement to the class unintentionally that my voice is the one that matters. And I was doing this so subconsciously, I didn't realize it until I started really working on this skill. All right. So then let's talk a little bit about those follow-up questions. This really started, we really started working on this in my class when we were doing regular social mixers with community members. So we'd have these community volunteers who would come in just once a month for a conversation coffee hour with the intermediate and advanced students. And I realized that there was a lot of, one question, one answer sort of interview style conversation happening. And I said, I really think we need to work on follow-up questions. And so one way we started that was in writing. So I would give them some snippet of information, and it could be, most of them were fictional. And for example, my sister got married last week in Florida. And then they would sit and they would think through some follow-up questions. And they would practice writing out those follow-up questions. And we would share our questions with each other. And we would give grammatical feedback on questions. Question formation is a fairly complex grammar topic. So if your students aren't there yet, that's definitely something to sort of plan. How am I going to work question formation into my lessons? And what my students discovered really quite early on was, if you can't think of a follow-up question, ask why. So they would pretty quickly figure out how to form why questions about most things that people said, but now their questions are much more varied. All right, and then the adding on part, which you can add to this activity. So there, in a more complex version of this activity, someone gives an answer, someone summarizes, someone asks a follow-up question, and then after follow-up questions have asked, people can volunteer to add on to what the original speaker said. And for adding on, I think sentence frames are a really great way to start this, getting students used to what it sounds like to connect their idea to someone else's previous idea. I agree with so-and-so because I would like to add to what he said because I would like to say one more thing about that topic. All right. And then Liddy's going to tell us a little bit about how she has used a picture activity to practice adding on.
Right. So I've also used those same frames. I agree with somebody because, and taught that. And we've done a lot of the conversations, especially in the. I did this in person, and I do a lot more of it now in the remote Zoom class, where I put up a picture and we have a conversation about it. There's a great, the New York Times has a great set of pictures called "What's Going On in This Picture." They post a new one every week, and at the end of the week, they reveal where the picture is from. But if you go back in the archives, you don't have to wait for the reveal of what the picture is or where it's from. So I post a picture, and I tell them I'm going to ask them 3 questions, and the 3 questions are: what's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you say? What more can you tell us? So it's always asking about, you know, the story, but as we've done this a couple of times, I've added in the idea that we learn more by looking at something with each other. So when, after somebody says something, the next comment, I invite them, I encourage them to say, well, I agree with what somebody said and this, or I disagree. I don't think that's happening because of this. You know, so in this picture, there is a lot of conversation of, oh, this must be a hospital because we're talking about COVID. And somebody said, well, I disagree because they're not wearing masks, or I agree with this person because of this. And it's gotten some really rich conversations. And again, the adding on has leaked out of the picture conversations into talking about text, talking about other ideas. I agree with somebody because, and Jessica said, by getting them in the last slide, by getting them to say that I agree with someone or I disagree with someone, we're getting that language into their mouths and getting that practice in saying it so that they can use it in other contexts. And also, I think it's really good for us to hear somebody say, I agree with you, or I disagree with you, and then move on because of this thing. So I think that it's useful in all kinds of ways, but it's been a good practice for that, adding on an idea.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to give you some more time in small groups here to talk about what you would do to introduce and teach these skills. Are there some activities that Liddy and I have talked about that you want to try out? Are there other things other ideas that you have for doing this? And I'll just give you a challenge as you go into your small group to think about, can you apply some of these conversational skills to your conversations with your group members? All right, so.
All right, we should have everyone back.
All right, great. So I thought I had my link ready to paste right into the chat here as we started, but it is not, that's not what's showing up. So I'll put out the call to anyone. That list of questions is at the Tessel J conversation questions online. So if somebody feels ambitious and wants to Google that for me and find it, it is the International Tessel Journal has a whole long archive of conversation questions, which are my go-to when I'm trying to get started. So I'm just going to crowdsource that one so that we can get right into the next slide. There we go. Thanks, Marisa. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the logistics of doing small group conversations if you've not done them already. So you want to give some thought to how you're going to group students, especially if you have a large class or a multi-level class. If you have some really outgoing students and some really shy students, there are lots of different approaches that work. You might want to sort of separate those groups, or you might want to have multi-level groups together so that they can help and model things for each other. Just give it some thought before you go into your class. And then also thinking about when you're going to create breakout groups. As I'm sure Marisa will tell you, doing the background piece in Zoom to actually create the breakout groups, it's not that hard, but it's a little time consuming. And if you're also trying to think about strategic groupings at the same time, you'll need to give yourself a couple of quiet minutes. So usually that's when I post questions on the screen and ask students to read through them, ask them to copy them into their notebooks. I usually give them some type of task during that time so that I have a little quiet time to create my groups. And then think about not just what questions you're going to ask, but how are you going to provide the questions to them? Do you want to put them into the chat and make sure that students all know how to use the chat? Do you want to project them on the screen and then ask them to either copy them down or take a screenshot? Or I've actually done it where I work it right into the activity as a dictation. And before we do conversation groups, we do a dictation, and the dictation is the questions they're going to use. So then when we get ready to go into conversation groups, they've already all got them in their notebook. And then thinking about how you will monitor those groups. Someone asked before if the host can sort of stop into each room, and they absolutely can. That's one of the things I really like about Zoom, if you're using Zoom. This is also a great role for volunteers. So if you're in the lucky position of having classroom volunteers during this time, I have a large number of volunteers, and I teach a speaking class where I teach a lesson for about 20 minutes, and then we all get into breakout rooms for sometimes up to 30, 40 minutes, and volunteers help keep these conversations going and provide feedback for the students. So that's the nice thing about having a volunteer in the room, is that there's somebody there who can give students feedback if students really want more feedback on their speaking and pronunciation. And so there it is. So thinking about how you'll give feedback. If you don't have the option of volunteers, the other thing I do sometimes is hop in and out of those rooms and take notes while I'm listening. And then when we reconvene, I will give a quick use the whiteboard tool and give a quick mini lesson on something that I've noticed many students were struggling with. So those are some logistics things to think about. There's also a feature in Zoom, if you're using that I really like, where people in small groups can hit a help button. And when they do, the host gets a message that they need help in a particular breakout room. So I've taught students how to use that. And then if they're having difficulties, either technical difficulties or difficulties with the activity, it's a way for them to get my attention, and then I can go into that room. All right. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for coming today, because I really do think that speaking and listening and making connections to each other right now is particularly important, both for teachers and for students. So we have just a little bit of time here at the end, about 7 minutes, for your questions, your comments. So again, as we did before, I think I'll invite you to put something in the chat if you would like to speak, and then Liddy will call on you and we'll go that way.
Yeah, there was a question earlier I want to address first. So somebody asked about assigning more specific roles to people. In the in-person classroom, I absolutely had people take each job. And I've done it some, it's been a little more challenging for people to hold on to what number am I in this. So we are still practicing that in my classroom. However, one of the things I think about, I found really helpful in having each person having their own specific job is I've talked to them about, for some of us, talking is really easy. And for some of us, it's not talking is really hard. And so by being the person who is listening and summarizing when what you really want to do is jump in and have your own idea is a challenge. And so I've acknowledged that for them, and they nod their head. One of those is either really easy or really difficult, and that's a really important thing in a conversation to remember. Sometimes I need to not talk. And then I say, and then for the people who it's really hard, to get them going, make sure you're inviting them to speak. So I think that acknowledging that is one of those things. And the last thing was, there was something in one of the questions that when we ask questions, I also make sure I tell my students, your job is to get to know your classmates and to get to be known. And you also don't have to answer anything that you're not comfortable with. And so I want to make sure that I try not to have questions that ask those things. But if I do, or if somebody asks a follow-up question, answer as honestly as you can and as comfortably as you can. So, I want to give them that language and give them that permission to say, not today, or that's not an okay question for right now. So I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. Yes, that is also a rule in my classroom, and I forgot to mention that.
Yep. I'm looking for other questions.
Good.
Are there others? Let's see.
So far, you all are so kind. It's just full of all these kudos. So much appreciated. I do think, like I said, this is one of my favorite activities because it is so rich in skill building while being so simple in terms of prep. It can be a little complex in terms of scaffolding, depending on who your learners are, but the prep is simple. And so then you get to really focus on how you're going to teach it and how you're going to get students ready to do this work.
And they love it. They do. They love it.
Yeah. Yep. And, I think like Liddy said, the real mark of success is when you start to see the skills from this activity bleed over into other conversations and other activities throughout your teaching.
Somebody asked a question about other frames other than I agree and I disagree. When I'm doing with the picture, it's, I noticed that, this thing and somebody else noticed it, that's similar to agree, or I want to add on, I have a new idea of why, this is the reason it is. So those are some of those.
Good. Oh, and I see someone asking how long does the activity go on? I think that's going to depend a lot on your learners and also how many questions you're able to give them. So when I was doing this in person, I would make like long lists, like students would get a whole page of questions, and then they could pick and choose from the questions on the page. And we would sometimes have conversation time that would go on for 45 minutes once they were comfortable with the activity. But I would say in this Zoom environment, kind of the longest we've done is 30 minutes. And that's usually with a volunteer helping to facilitate, just to kind of keep things going. So, if students are facilitating their own groups, 10 to 15 minutes will probably be enough time, or at least enough time before you pull everybody back together and kind of regroup and do some mini lessons and then maybe send them back out again.
Yeah, I agree with that. About 10 minutes online. I also will use the same questions, more than once. So they would be in a different group. And maybe even though you asked this question to somebody else yesterday, that's fine. You'll get a different conversation with a different group. And in the in-person world, after we did it a bunch of times, it was also a fabulous activity for subs. And subs loved it and the students loved it. So it was really engaging in that way too.
Yep, agreed. Let's see, sentence frame ideas for restating or summarizing. When my students were getting started, we would just use, the name of the student and then said. So Jessica said, blah, blah, blah. But you could think about some of those things that could also be used as clarification strategies. So when I teach clarification strategies with students, I often, especially like on the job clarification, I really encourage them to use summarizing as a way to check if they've understood. And so they will say like, let me see if I understood what you said, and then they'll rephrase. A lot of my students now will just paraphrase and summarize, but then when they're done, they'll say, Liddy, is that right? So they will check with the original speaker to see if their summary was correct. And then that person has the opportunity to clarify if needed.
I'm jumping in to thank people here. Excuse me. Liddy and Jessica, thank you so much. And I want to a big shout out. If people have yet to find their little applause button, now's a good time because Maurice's on this and Andrea should come on camera too. It has taken a village to put on this conference. And I want to thank you. You have left with a bang, you guys, with Liddy and Jessica's session. So thank you so much to both of you for putting on this excellent session, and to Marisa and Andrea for all of their tech support throughout the conference. And if Gail and the other hosts were here, I would tell them the same thing, but I'll have to jump into their sessions separately. So thank you for being part of this. We've never done quite this before, but yay, we will do it again. So thank you so much for joining us. Go team. All right, thank you, Allison. All right,
Thanks for coming
everyone.
on this beautiful